Welcome to Healing Minds, Stories of Resiliency and Recovery, a conversation held at the intersection of substance abuse, mental health, and everyday living. Your hosts, Mark Regala and Justin Wolf, bring both professional expertise and personal understanding to the table. So welcome to the conversation. Let's dive in.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Healing Minds, Story of Resiliency and Recovery. And tonight, we are going to be diving into talking about and discussing what it's like to live with the dual diagnosis, as well as navigating those challenges and those barriers that arise in the process. And so, Mark, how are you doing tonight, man?
Doing good. Middle of August now. Football seasons are on the corner. Kids are back at school or going back to school within the next week. And the end of summer is approaching. Kind of hard to believe.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to, the kids getting back in school. Let's just put it that way.
I'm sure you are.
We're in the dog days of summer. I get what they meant by that saying now, where it's kind of like, hey, there's a lull, activities are done, and it's just like they're like just bouncing off the wall, like those freaking bouncing balls, man. It's nuts.
When I was younger and had young kids, I felt the same way as you. Now I'm older and I'm looking forward to football season.
It's the simple things. It's the simple things.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So I think what we're going to be talking about today is something that just is very commonly discussed and thrown about when that term is thrown out there, dual diagnosis. People are often like, well, what does that mean? Well, we're really going to kind of dive into that here, because when we talk about living with a dual diagnosis, it can feel as if you are like a plate spinner. And you got all these plates spinning and it's your life and you're just trying to keep them all up. And you're just really giving it, you're all paying attention, just trying to make sure that whatever you do, you don't cause one of those plates to fall. And those plates and the way in which we're keeping up are all interconnected in the way in which we're moving. And that's exactly what happens when we talk about that relationship between our mental health and our substance use and addiction. And so when we talk about what a dual diagnosis is, in its simplest way of kind of putting it, it is living with a mental health condition, whether that's anxiety, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, and also having a substance use disorder diagnosis. So really battling and looking at the interrelation between these two and how one can kind of feed off the other, influence the other, and how we can navigate life moving forward. And so Mark, I know you do a lot of public speaking when you kind of go into the hotels. When you go into the hospital system, yeah. Welcome to the high. Here's Mark. No, and you're talking to like all the clients there and kind of sharing your story. How do you kind of break it down for them, man, about what it meant to have a dual diagnosis?
I share my story. And again, my story is I had an ignorance when it came to mental health. So, I hindsight looking back at it, had mental health, undiagnosed mental health conditions dating back to when I was a child. I just never sought help, thought it was normal, maybe thought that I had to man up, if you will, because of society and so forth. But, I had PTSD. I just didn't know I had PTSD. I certainly knew that I had anxiety because I would get panic attacks at a very young age. I remember my very first panic attack was doing a presentation in middle school about the JFK assassination. I had my little 3x5 index cards and I was doing my presentation in history class and I just locked up. Didn't know what it was, but, certainly felt like I was having a heart attack, couldn't breathe, couldn't get the words out. Left the front of the class, went in the back of the room, started crying. And honestly, anytime I spoke publicly, that would happen. I mean, that happened a lot when I was an executive in the insurance industry. And then, with the depression for myself, most of that was situational. I can't speak about the bipolar side of things or anything like that. So that was just not being able to balance the stresses of life, the turbulence of life, everything that was going on with me. But the anxiety and the PTSD was always there. I just never knew it. I just
Yeah.
never knew it as a panic attack. I never knew it as an anxiety. I literally thought there was just something wrong with me and I was defective, if you will. I mean, it would
Yeah.
drive me crazy when I would do a presentation at a corporate event and lock up and not be able to get the words out when you know the content of the insurance industry, because that's the industry that I was in. And then you get somebody who's a rookie or has a fraction of the experience that you have, and they speak so elegantly about a topic and share the same information that you could have shared and then some because of my experiences, but you couldn't get the words out. So, I didn't have much confidence. I did not know it as a full blown panic attack. And, what happened to me personally was I started to self medicate, but I didn't know I was self medicating because I didn't know what I was medicating from.
Yeah.
So it started with, the drinking. And then I was introduced to prescription pain medicine as a result of a neck and back issue. And then it really escalated with the pain medicine. And it was only when I was in full blown addiction with alcohol and drugs, opiate pain medicine, is when I sought help and started talking to a therapist because I thought a therapist was basically me being weak as a man because that's how I was raised.
Right.
You got to be strong, you got to be tough, you got to man up. And when she hit me with, the PTSD thing, I mean, again, first thing I said is I didn't fight in the military. I don't have a military background. I can't have PTSD because that's what I always thought that was. I didn't realize it could be a trauma that you were subjected to as a child. Um, the anxiety made sense when she described that to me. And she described a panic attack. I realized I was living with these pretty much my whole life. And the depression at that point, I kind of knew was there. I was again just trying to just battle through it. But I didn't view alcohol as a form of self medication. I didn't view the opiate pain medicine as a form of self medication until I had that aha moment of working with the therapist. And then I realized, okay, this is what's happening. I'm doing this to try to cope with that, and that's unhealthy. The only thing is, I was so far into the weeds of my addictions, it was such a process to get out of that hell that I was in. But I think a lot of times people don't have that underlying mental health diagnosis they're battling. And as a result, they go down that path of alcohol and or drugs. And then they start working with somebody and then they realize, okay, well, you have this or you have that or what have you. Because of stigma,
Mm-hmm.
because of society, because you got to quote, quote, man up, because maybe that's how you're raised, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Because that's why I never talked to a therapist. I thought it was weak to talk to a therapist
Mm-hmm.
for the longest time until I just basically surrendered because I didn't know how to get out of the hell that I was in.
Right. And I think what you're kind of highlighting there is like so common and so persistent where it's like, hey, you know what? I'm going to figure this out on my own. Right. Because asking
Yeah,
for help or admitting that this is a problem could be that sign of weakness. And I can't let that be. I need to kind of get through this. And what our mind is giving us again is like our own best solution, which is just furthering the problem. It's like, hey, I thought I could figure this out. Well, I keep going back to the same thing, expecting different results. And now we're talking about insanity,
yep,
right? So that's really a huge part of this challenge is really what you named there is that stigma, which is just so embedded into our culture, into society, where people feel like there's something wrong with them and that they can't name it, talk about it, and it stops them from reaching out for help because they just don't know what it is exactly, but just something's wrong and something's different about me.
yeah. And I live with a long time of keeping my feelings inside. Because I thought it would be viewed as a weakness if I
Right.
described how I felt, right? Um, I thought that talking to a therapist, was a sign of weakness. I mean, I don't know if that's just how I was raised. I don't know. Maybe it has to do with society thing. Uh, when I speak now, I mean, I tell people, that the true sign of strength is being able to talk through your feelings. And the true sign of strength is to get the help that you need to become a better person and a sober person and keep your mental health in check. My mind, my mindset has done a complete 180 compared to what I was prior versus now through the education that I
Yeah.
have gotten by doing the work that I do and living with my live life experience and so forth.
Yeah. And as you're talking, I'm just kind of thinking, and it's just like echoing in my mind, like what I've heard numerous people say, and it's like
Yeah.
even myself say, where it's like, hey, I just don't want to feel this way, but I'm not really sure I want to give up what I'm doing out there. Where it's like, I'm not sure if I want to stop drinking, smoking, popping, snorting. Like, I'm not sure if I want to give that up, but I just know I want to feel better because I don't like the way that my mood is right now.
I think there was a time when I felt that, but it got so bad and it caused so much destruction in my life that I got to the point where it's like, no matter what I need to do, I got to get out of this.
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't want to drink or do pills or anything like that anymore because it just caused so much destruction and so much more pain. And it's a
Right.
path, unfortunately, I didn't have to go down, but I went down.
Mm-hmm.
And I went down most likely because of that ignorance and that mindset and not getting the help that I needed sooner. But then again, it's like when you live with that your whole life, you just think that that's kind of normal too.
Mm-hmm.
You
Like,
know,
what doesn't everybody else go through this?
if that's all that you know, you don't think that that you're abnormal.
Right.
If that makes sense, I don't know if it does or not, but I mean that's literally all that I knew was, I was always a very anxious individual. Um,
Right.
and the panic attacks. I mean, obviously, I knew there was something wrong with me there. I just didn't know what it was. It's like, why can't you speak publicly? Why can't you do a presentation at a meeting or whatever it might be? But the anxiousness, I just thought that was normal because that's something that I lived with my whole life.
Right. Oh, and like that cycle that gets created, like in the process, like those two kind of feeding off one another, like that's a really tough cycle to break, especially when it's been so longly, so present for so long. And I think that creates some challenge where it's like, hey, I've had this my whole life. Like, what are you trying to tell me? There's something different out there I can do? How am I going to do that? Where am I going to get those skills, that knowledge, those resources? How can I, cope with this feeling that my solution is also a problem here? And you're going to tell me there's another way. Like that can feel overwhelming to kind of tackle that beast.
Yeah. I mean, I even remember the very first person that told me, Mark, you're self medicating. And my response was, self medicating from what? And they almost
Mm-hmm.
looked at me like I was crazy because they knew I had some issues going on inside. They knew the type of person I was. But again, that's all that I knew. So I just thought that was normal. So I didn't even view it as a self medication, the drinking,
Yeah.
or the pills. The pills, maybe, because I do remember being very early on realizing that it was a little easier to deal with the stresses of life with an extra pill or two in your system.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember the very first meeting that I ran, and I was very nervous. It was at a corporate event. I was speaking in front of a large group of people, and I got this idea of taking another pill or two to see if that would help me. And I swear it was one of the best public presentations I ever did. I didn't have
Yeah.
a panic attack on stage. So I realized that, okay, remember, there's probably a form of self medication there, but you got to do this to perform your job, to feed your family. So now you're caught in that cycle too, right?
Right. No, I mean, those are like a lot of those challenges where it's like, hey, if I stop doing this, how am I going to function now? Or
Yeah.
I don't even have the time to step aside and go to treatment because I'm the only one working in my household. So how are bills going to get paid? How are things going to get taken care of? Right? There's a lot of challenges that people face when they have to go and figure out, like, I'm ready to take that step and no longer live this way. And life still goes on. Life is still happening, and I still got to produce or perform or show up in a way that's not going to, impede my lifestyle here and hurt those in my family.
Well, it's not even that. It's like, you have a team of 30 sales representatives, that you're in charge of, and you're helping them produce, you're helping them hit their numbers. They have to hit their quotas. If they don't hit their quotas, they get pay cuts. If they don't hit their quotas for a significant period of time, they potentially can lose their job. So it was a lot of responsibility that you had to fulfill. Plus, you had the financial responsibility at home because I was the sole income provider. And I always tell people, I always said to myself, you know, I was honestly just going to try to quit cold turkey and just try to withdraw. Okay, next weekend,
Yeah.
next weekend, next weekend, next week, whatever it might be. I'll take a few days off of work. Guess what? Life doesn't stop, man.
Mm-hmm.
Life doesn't stop. There's always going to be next week, next week, next week. And in the meantime, you're going deeper and deeper into the weeds. And, I come to the realization, and this is going to sound pretty sad, but you owe it to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I've said this before, there's one area to be selfish in, and I've learned this through experience. It's on the addiction side and alcoholism side and the mental health side. That's the one area you need to be selfish in. And I wasn't selfish. There was always a reason because of other responsibilities I had to not go get the help that I needed, for inpatient or what have you. And the sad part about it is a lot of those reasons aren't even in my life right now. My wife eventually left me. I still got a strained relationship with my kids. I haven't met my grandkids. Those sales reps, out of 30,
Mm-hmm.
a handful of them talk to me and check in with me every now and then, but the vast majority of them never even called me one time after I left that company and say, "How are you doing?"
Yeah.
So you had all these people that you were trying to make a priority and try to help them out, and you're putting them above your own health. And at the end of the day, it caused you a lot of pain. That's why I say it's one area. It's one area to be okay to be selfish, and you got to put yourself first. And that's your sobriety and your mental health. Because once I got the help that I needed and was able to focus on doing what I needed to do, my life did a 180, complete
Right.
180, and completely changed in so many ways for the better. The way I perceive life right now, the way I live life right now, dietary, obviously physical fitness, we've talked about it, living a life of service and helping others. But it was a process to get there. And I delayed that process and made things so much more difficult for a long time. Part of that probably was denial.
Yeah.
Part of that probably was denial. I'm sure a lot of it had to do with shame and guilt.
Right.
Afraid to tell people that you need the help or what have you. But at the end of the day, I made it so much more difficult than it needed to be.
Right. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, like you said, shame, guilt, denial. Like it all kind of comes together there because it's like, hey, this is all about, I'm trying to like protect myself and not kind of feel this pain. And it's coming from like this self-preservation stance as opposed to saying like, I just want to find like the least painful way to kind of navigate this with
Well,
as few changes as possible. Like, please tell me how to do this. And that doesn't exist. It's like the only way to get past it, right, is to go through it.
true, but again, look at the drug that I was abusing,
Yeah.
which was painkillers for a physical pain for the neck and back. But I say it and I'll say it over and over again. Opiate painkillers work really well for physical pain, but they work unbelievable for emotional pain. So if
Right.
you get that emotional pain inside you, okay, and you start taking some extra pills, it makes it a lot easier to go through the stresses of life, but you don't realize what you're actually doing to your body and how it's basically rewiring your brain
Mm-hmm.
and your body's becoming physically addicted and the hell you're going to go through going through withdrawals trying to get off that stuff. And then what you got to deal with that first year coming off that stuff, with cravings and the acute withdrawal syndrome and the insomnia and everything else. Uh, I obviously learned the hard way, school of hard knocks, as I've said before. I mean, it's basically what it came down to.
Yeah.
I mean, I lived and learned,
Right.
and I tell people all the time, I never want to go back to that life. I never want to go back to that life of drinking like I was drinking in excess, and I certainly don't want to go back to that life of taking opiates or any form of mind-altering substance.
Yeah. I mean, especially
Never.
when you're talking about like, hey, that emotional painkiller properties that it had. I mean, that they kind of like say, hey, there's no way to kind of get rid of this pain without kind of looking at it, feeling it, and going through it in order for it no longer to have that control. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges, right? Is kind of tapping into that part that's so protected
Yeah.
by the use and the other behaviors that kind of tie into it, where it's like, if I let down my defenses and now I kind of open this up, we're emotionally vulnerable. And especially when you're talking about like with PTSD and like trauma, I mean, feeling vulnerable is a position that one will go great lengths to avoid,
Yeah,
no matter what that cost is to themselves.
true. Very true. I mean, that's 100% statement there. You just want to run
Right.
because you don't want to expose yourself. You don't want to feel those feelings on the inside. But again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. I thought that those feelings on the inside were normal. That was just part of life. I didn't know I had a medical diagnosis. That's where the ignorance came in.
Right.
And the ignorance came in for the failure to get the help or talk to somebody because I thought in my mind I was weak and I thought in my mind I could just battle through it myself. And, I look at it now. I mean, and I tell people all the time, don't view it as a sign of weakness because you're in the hospital or you're talking to a therapist or you're going to AA. In my opinion, that's a strength that you possess. And then if you get to the point where you're living in recovery with your mental health, as well as your addiction or alcoholism in recovery, that's a, that's that's like a superpower in my eyes. I think Eric, who we've had in the
Yeah.
guest before, refers to that as a superpower as well.
Right. No, I know that's the big thing he's always mentioned where it's like, hey, like look at like your knowledge and your wisdom that you gained by going through this process and coming out on the other side and not letting this, take you away from you. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in this process, right? It's kind of like reclaiming yourself on this journey while navigating and attending to your own mental health needs as well as living a life of recovery. And it's hard when you have to balance providers and seeing therapists, seeing a medication provider, even finding out where do I even find treatment for this? Who even specializes in this? And what if my providers are in different spots and they're not working out of the same office? Are they going to talk with each other? And a lot of times they might have conflicting views about what is the primary problem and what needs to be worked on first. And so your treatment team can be misaligned, especially if they're not working closely together. So that, as the person receiving that help, can feel like you're Stretch Armstrong just getting pulled in all these different directions. And it's just like, tell me what to do. And at the same time, you're taking all these new medications that are altering your brain chemistry.
That's what I was going to tell you. I mean, sometimes they're trying different meds on you to see what works out the best. From a therapist perspective, I mean, sometimes you start working with the therapist and it's just not working out. That doesn't mean that all therapists are not going to jive with you. I mean, I went through a few different therapists before I found the therapist that really got through to me and I had a tremendous relationship with. But I mean, it's just being proactive, like we talked about before, and trying different things. Just because one thing doesn't work, I talk to people all the time. Therapy doesn't work for me. Well, how many times you go? Well, I went a few times. I didn't like the therapist. Okay, would you try going to another therapist? No. Well, then how can you say therapy doesn't work for you? Well, it didn't work that time. I mean, not all therapists are the same.
Right.
Therapists got their strengths and weaknesses too, just like we do in our profession as well. You got to find one that's gonna jive well or cater well to your specific diagnosis and your specific addictions. And I tell you, the therapist that I work with, when I walked in there for the very first time with the therapist that really, really got me, I said, there's no way in hell this is going to work. I prejudged.
Right.
Because she was female and she was very young. And I'm like, what the hell is she going to do talking to an old man like me? But the way she got through to me and the relationship we built, and the way she was able to describe things, it just made sense to me. I'm forever grateful for her.
No, and I think that's a huge part of what that helping relationship does, right? It's like helping you feel understood. And I think that is a huge component that gets missed a lot of times by providers, by helpers, where they might have training in addiction or they might have training in mental health, but not everybody has the training in both. And so people will tend to then navigate towards what they feel comfortable with is what's driving the behavior and what's the best form of treatment. While we're saying, hey, I'm going to focus on your mental health. We don't really need to focus on your substance use. or we're going to focus primarily on your use and not really touch your mental health. But we all know, and it's been shown and validated through research, is that you got to address them both at the same time, because they do not walk separately. They walk together.
Correct. And it's the same thing. I mean, I believe in a very diversified approach. Okay, so yeah, you got your therapist. Yes, you got your medications. Yes, you got to do activities on a daily basis. But the same thing can be said about different support groups. We use AA as an example. I talked to me. AA doesn't work for me. How many meetings did you go to? One. I just didn't like it. Well, did you try different meetings? There's different styles of meetings. The same thing with support groups like here at NAMI. I mean, recovery is not a one size fits all. You have to find what's best for you, and you have to be proactive, and you have to be on this quest of education and this quest for knowledge to be able to live the life that you want to live moving forward.
And that support network is so powerful, because it's all about that connection and building those relationships when you felt like you've been living on an island that nobody else knows exists on this world. and it's like, oh, you actually get it. You've been in that same spot where you feel like nobody possibly understands you, and that nobody could possibly have felt the pain that you feel. You too. I mean, it's just so validating and affirming to kind of get that response and not kind of be stuck in that cell of isolation there. And so,
and the one thing that's amazing, and we've talked about this before, I mentioned this during that podcast with Ted, and him and I were kind of like joking about this, but it's true. Okay. He mentioned it and I mentioned it. And that's when you drive the narrative in a conversation, it's unbelievable, like how people just open up to you and you realize how common it is. I remember I made this comment in a podcast. This is going back a while ago now, but I said, when I started getting really transparent with the fact that I'm a dual diagnosis, and I'm an addict and alcoholic living in recovery, and I got the mental health diagnosis, and I started sharing stuff on Facebook and, started a Facebook page and all that stuff. And then everybody started coming to me through Messenger, people texting me and stuff like that. I realized I'm not weird. I'm normal. I mean, this is normal. It just took me to bring the subject matter to the table for people to open up and talk. For what we talked about earlier, shame, guilt, they view it as weakness, whatever it might be. But once they feel that they can talk to you about this topic, man, the doors swing open, and you wouldn't believe the conversations that you have going out to dinner with an old friend, or a conversation over the phone later at night, or messages on, like I said, Messenger or social media or whatever. I mean, this is the world we live in right now. We live in a world that's going through a mental health crisis and an alcohol and addiction crisis more often than not. Okay, probably a hell of a lot more often than not. I don't know what the percentages are. You're going to talk to somebody, and most likely they're going to have a story on their family right now.
Yeah.
There's no shame. There's no guilt. It's not a sign of weakness. We have to feel comfortable, but that's where we got to change the narrative as a society when it comes to the whole thing about stigma and that. We've gotten so much better, but we have a long way to go.
Right. Because when you're talking about the power there of your story and kind of relating and coming across like, hey, he's a real person. You're coming across genuine. And when you come across somebody who's genuine, that resonates, because we all know that what it feels like to come across somebody who's disingenuine and what that brings up, right? So there's so much power in saying, hey, I'm accepting of all of me. I'm not hiding parts. I'm not trying to dismiss this or minimize or ignore this. No, this is me. And it's coming to be in a place of hey, I can get comfortable in my own skin, acknowledging and bringing all this with me in every interaction I'm having with another person. It's very freeing. And people gravitate towards that, and they match that level of genuineness and authenticity. That's why those relationships that are built in the rooms are so powerful.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's 100% the truth. And again, I would have never have thought that in a million years. I mean, I was so scared. I mean, I remember the first day of meeting I went to, I was so scared to say, my name is Mark, I'm an alcoholic. I don't know why. I just was. It was shame. It was guilt. It was all the feelings. You know, people joke about the comedians sometimes joke about it on television and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know, or they make a joke about it in the movie, whatever it might be. Man, there's all kinds of walks of life in those meetings seeking help, and the attendance has grown so much. You know, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, that
Right.
doesn't define who you are. It
Right.
just doesn't define who you are as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's got challenges. Everybody's got sicknesses. Okay, the sickness or disease that they live with doesn't typically define who they are as a human being and what type of heart they have, and you know how loving they are, and how affectionate they are, and how empathetic they are. Okay, again, we have a disease. It's not all defining. It's just something that we live with. It's something that we're most likely we're born with. You know,
Mm-hmm.
with the chemistry in our brain.
Right. No, and I think that statement right there by you, Mark, is a wonderful way to kind of like wrap up the episode and really kind of capture what it means to live with and have a dual diagnosis. And so I appreciate all your personal wisdom and sharing of like your story that, again, I think really captures this topic and this very, very well. So thank you, as always, man, my man.
Yeah, well, thank you as well. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Yeah. So as always, we're happy everybody's joining us on these discussions. These podcasts will air on the 15th and 30th of each month. And so be sure to tune in then. Mark and I are open to comments and suggestions, so feel free to reach out to us at namidupage.org/podcast. Again, namidupage.org/podcast to connect with us. And until next time, you all take care, and we will look forward to you on the next podcast.
Take care, everybody. Thank you for watching.
Thanks for joining us today on Healing Minds, Stories of Resiliency and Recovery. If you're on the journey to find guidance and insights, subscribe now wherever you find your podcasts. Healing Minds, Stories of Resiliency and Recovery is an educational resource, not a substitute for medical or therapeutic advice. The opinions expressed by the hosts and their guests are not necessarily those of NAMI DuPage. Go to namidupage.org/podcast for links to past episodes, show notes, and to submit a question or topic ideas for a future episode. Until next time, be well.